Hello, students. I have a question for you. What is your annual cycle? Perhaps something you never really thought about before, but I bet you could put it together, and chances are it looks something like this. Okay, you're in school, and you go on vacation, and then you go on school, and then you go on to summer vacation, and then you repeat, right? So school, Christmas vacation, school, summer, school, Christmas vacation, school, summer. So that kind of defines your annual year. And for age roughly 5 until age 22-ish, when you graduate from college, depending on a whole bunch of different variables and grad school and breaks and whatnot, this is probably what it looks like for you. Your annual cycle is, I go to school in the fall semester, I have a little Christmas vacation, I go to school in the spring semester, maybe a little spring break thrown in there, and then I have a summer vacation. And what you do in those vacations is different, right? But you get the idea that you have this normal pattern to life, and it kind of defines your circumstances. It often means I'm going to work in the summer and I'm going to enjoy time with family during Christmas vacation. I'm going to bear down and focus on school for these 2 periods. Well, we're going to translate this idea and look at what are the annual cycles of birds, because many of them also have very predictable, understandable cycles, most of them tied to breeding and reproduction, but how do they meet their needs so that they can maximize breeding and reproduction? So we're going to talk about annual cycles of birds. So these annual cycles are sometimes called circannual, which basically just means annual cycles of birds, are going to differ depending on if you're migratory. Now, last week in lab, we had a day where we just focused on, are birds migratory or not for every species? And what we found is a tremendous diversity. Some birds migrate long distances, others do not. And we've talked a little bit about migration. We haven't talked that much about why they migrate. We mostly think it has to do with whether they can find sufficient food where they live year-round, and about safety during breeding season, and sometimes safety during the other parts of the year, but safety during breeding season, and how much food and how much competition for those foods. So it's complex and multifaceted: food, competition, safety, etc. So eventually we've got the patterns where some birds migrate and others do not. So for non-migratory birds, their annual cycle looks like this. I breed, right? Or sorry, they breed, I'm not a bird. They breed, and they're breeding right now. This is the breeding season, which is during the summer for the vast majority of birds, especially if they live in the temperate zone where you have seasons, and tropics is different. And then they molt after they breed. So usually they molt in the fall, and then they survive again until it's breeding season again. So the winter is just survival time. They're not really trying to accomplish much. What they're trying to accomplish is reproducing and breeding. Compare that to migratory species, which have a couple of different strategies, which are much more complex. They also breed, and then they usually molt. They usually molt in the fall as well. And then they migrate. So in North America, they head south, and then they just survive over winter somewhere, finding enough food to survive, and then get ready quickly to fatten up, and then migrate back north again, and then they breed again. So same pattern over and over: breed, molt, migrate, survive, migrate, breed, molt, migrate, survive, migrate. That would be a good cycle for a bird like an eastern kingbird that doesn't have different plumages, a basic plumage and an alternate plumage. If you have an alternate plumage, then it gets even more complex. It goes breed, molt into your pre-basic, into your basic molt, and then migrate, and then survive, and then pre-alternate molt, and then migrate, and then breed. Oh my, it's getting complex. But what we do see again are that even if it's a little bit complex, we start including molting and migrating and whatnot, that the cycle for these birds, if they survive long enough to live a few years, looks very regular. And so what we want to do is understand, how do they know when to breed? How do they know when to molt? How do they know when to migrate? How do these patterns get built into their biological, insights, into their genetic clock? All these factors, we're really interested in that, right? So how do they know when it's time to change? Basically, I mean, how do they know when it's time to molt? How do they know when it's time to migrate? How do they know when it's time to breed? And these are interesting questions that ornithologists have wondered about. And so we did some experiments to try and figure them out. What is controlling the circadian and circannual rhythm? So circadian is talking about daily rhythms of what time you wake up. I get into circadian rhythms. If I wake up early for a few weeks, I'll start waking up early even on weekends because my body's just used to waking up at a certain time. So circadian, those are the daily rhythms, and circannual, those are the annual rhythms. We often call these a biological clock. We sometimes say that in common speak, and without maybe recognizing that this is a real thing, that we all have a system within our bodies that recognizes daily patterns of timing and annual patterns of timing, and that those are influenced by a number of different things. So it won't surprise you, I hope, that birds also have something along these lines that influences the timing of their molting and migrating and breeding and everything else. So let's talk about some of the research projects that we have done to help us understand what influences the timing of all of these different phenomena. Okay, here's the story first of a bird. This is a bird that lives in Europe called the common chaffinch. And it was experimentally exposed to just darkness all day long for weeks and months, right? So they basically were never exposed to daylight. And they said, what would happen to these birds, to their annual cycles, if they never saw sun? Not only did they not see a change in day length, they didn't even see the sun, because one of the guesses is that changes in day length drives these things. And what they found is that they did have regular cycles of sort of active during a certain part of the day and then sleep during a certain part of the day. So your cycles of sleep and activity are built into you genetically, and they're influenced by things like day length, but they're not exclusively determined by that. And one thing that's interesting is that their cycles started to end up on a 23-hour cycle instead of a 24-hour cycle. So this doesn't mean that our days are supposed to be 23 hours long or anything like that. I think it probably just means that the cycles are not completely precise, that they work pretty well, but they might get off a little bit. And so over time, if they couldn't sense day length, then those cycles would end up a little weird. Okay, so that tells us, number one, is that we do have something built into us genetically that tells us that it's time to be active and it's time to sleep, and we do that in regular patterns. That in the absence of daylight cues, what we didn't see is them just sort of doing willy-nilly, oh, I'll just sleep sometimes and I'll just be active other times, I'll just whatever. They had their regular cycles. Okay, evidence number two. Here's another English bird called a house sparrow. We do have these in North America, but we consider them invasive species that we don't like that much. Somebody said, maybe that there's something in their glands that are influencing their rhythms. And so they removed the pineal gland, which is a gland that's in their brain. And so let's see what happens in this circumstance. So what they found is that when their pineal gland was removed, those regular 24-hour cycles disappeared. And they did start eating at weird times of day and sleeping at weird times of day, and they were irregular, they became random. So what did we learn from this? Do birds have a biological clock? Yes, they do, right? That they are influenced by something that has to do with their pineal gland that tells them it's time to have regular cycles of eating and sleeping and whatnot. So that's kind of a sense for their daily cycles. What about their annual cycles? What about their circannual cycles? Well, again, let's go through some different research projects. One study was looking again at British songbirds. Probably many of these are probably done by the same research group. Sounds like they're interested in all the same projects, where those birds were exposed to 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark, and it was always 12 hours of light and 12 hours of dark. Now that's a real life circumstance. That's roughly what life is like on the equator. If you've ever been there, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark every day of the year. And what they found is that these birds continued to come into breeding conditions. So they still had an annual cycle of breeding season, and my molt, I'm molt into my pre-alternate molt, and my gonads are going to grow and develop and mature. And so what they found is that they still had these regular cycles, but they were off a little bit. They happened on a 10-month cycle rather than a 12-month cycle as we would expect. So there appear to be some sort of biological control to their cycles of when to molt and when to breed, but that they need some sort of calibration from the outside world. Let's do another story of another research project. This was done on white-crowned sparrows. This is a North American bird that we see in the background. And for these birds, they exposed them to persistent long day lengths where they had 16 hours of light and 8 hours of darkness. And they did this for multiple years. And what they found in this case was that these white-crowned sparrows perpetually stayed in their non-breeding condition, right? So when they were just always exposed to long, now 16 hours of daylight, that's what things are like during the breeding season. But if they were kept in those conditions where it was always light conditions like during their breeding season, and they didn't come into their breeding plumage, and their gonads didn't mature, and they didn't develop into their breeding system. So this is really interesting. Let's tell another story and figure out see if we can get any more details. This is a research project done on these little birds called dark-eyed juncos, which I adore. They are birds that we have fairly regularly around here during migration and sometimes during winter, but they mostly breed up in northern Minnesota and Canada, so we don't see them during the breeding season. And here, they expose them to increasing amounts of daylight, first 8 hours of daylight, and then 10 hours, and then 12 hours, and then 14 hours over a period of weeks. So this is increasing day lengths. And what they found is that they could trick these juncos into coming into breeding condition, meaning that their reproductive organs were changing and getting ready for breeding season. And they could keep tricking them into doing that as many as 3 times during between the fall and the spring, which would be during the normal winter. So we're starting to see patterns here, right? The story of the white-crowned sparrow and the story that we saw here, where in the absence of light cues, they have normal cycles. And if you give them weird light cues that tells them it's perpetually summer, then they don't come into breeding condition. But if you get this cycle of where you have increasing day length, when do we have increasing day length? In the spring. If you have these patterns of increasing day length, you can trick their body into breeding repetitively. So what did we learn from this? Yes, they have patterns that control their rhythms, and they're mostly influenced by changes in day length. So, but this isn't the whole story. If we dig deeper into this, what we would find is that they are influenced not only by day length, and that's really important, but that's a sort of a big picture influencer, right? So changes in day length can be slow, gradual, predictable things that happen every year, and that changes in temperature also drive this. But there are other factors as well, things like did they find a mate, and is there enough food available to them, and those also seem to influence precisely what time they are starting their breeding season or starting their migration. And so we do have these big picture seasonal factors, and we call these ultimate factors. So the ultimate factor tells us that this is, when the days start getting longer, they say, okay, it's getting ready for breeding season. That still doesn't tell me exactly when it's time to start building my nest. And so those short-term, more micromanaging, fine-tuned stuff, those are more influenced by annual variation and variations dependent on the local region of, do they find a mate? Is there enough food available? And those sorts of things vary, right? So what we'll start to see is that certain birds will time their breeding season usually to when food is most abundant. And we just kind of take for granted that food is always most abundant during the summer, and that's generally true, but it's not true for all species. There are some species for which food is most available during other times of year, and so they'll switch timing of that. Most interesting example of this is great horned owl, because they're a big bird and they have a longer breeding season. When do you think food is most abundant for a great horned owl that mostly eats mice and little small rodents? Okay, think about that. Yeah, probably in the summer. That's when the mice start breeding. But if they have a really long breeding season and they want to time their feeding of their young to when mice are most abundant, that means they need to get started quite a bit earlier. And great horned owls, they start their nesting season in February and they're sitting on eggs in March. So think about how cold it is in March in Minnesota. They're sitting on eggs in the middle of what's basically still winter, so that their chicks are going to be hatching out and at their hungriest period in April and May and June, when those rodents are going full speed ahead and having lots of babies. So the food availability has a big influence on the precise timing of breeding. So we've also found that the final stages of gonadal development are influenced by other proximate factors like vegetation, growth patterns, and ritualized display and abundance of foods. And so again, here are a couple of seed-eating birds. Pinyon jays are a Western United States bird, and they mostly eat pinyon pines. They eat the seeds from pinyon pines. And we have seen that they will change their breeding patterns in response to the availability of pinyon pines. And if it was a good year where there are lots of seeds, then they'll breed sometimes a couple extra times. And if there's not very many seeds, then they'll only attempt one breeding season. Red crossbill is another really interesting one. They eat seeds out of mostly spruces, so also dependent on conifers. And sometimes those become most mature and available during the winter. And so crossbills also are one of these weird songbirds that will nest in the middle of winter because the seed crops are going to be most abundant in late winter for what they like to eat. So the timing of breeding is influenced by things like day length and temperature and food. And all the combination of things will influence their migration, their breeding season. Now, timing of migration is a little bit tricky also because we've learned that migration requires storing up a lot of fat so that you can get ready to migrate. So you can't just say, oh, I just feel like migrating today. It's a beautiful day and the wind conditions are right, so I'm just going to take off. Because if you haven't spent the week or 2 weeks building up enough fat, you're not going to survive. You have to build up fat. So birds have to start preparing to migrate even before they want to migrate. And this is something that usually requires a few weeks to a month. And the ultimate factor here again is called photoperiod, and photoperiod means day length. And this is, I love this word, it's one of the best words in ornithology. It's a German word called Zügenruhe, and it basically means migratory preparedness. And so as days start getting longer in the spring, the birds are recognizing that and saying, oh my, it's migration season's coming up. I better start eating more and storing more fat physiologically. And they actually start getting like more agitated and they move more. And they've done all these experiments on birds while they're getting ready to migrate versus birds during non-migratory times. And they're just kind of wiggly and ready to go all the time. So Zügenruhe is like a behavioral trait when they are anticipating migration. Now, so they start fattening up, they get ready to migrate. Does that tell them exactly what night to leave on? No, that's when the proximate factors come in. And those are mostly things like weather conditions. They don't want to fly into a headwind. A headwind means the wind is blowing right in your face because that means they're going to be working too hard and not getting much out of it. So they want to fly with a tailwind, and they don't want to fly into storms. And so if you take a warm spring or a cold fall, and then you get the right tailwind conditions, and they've been preparing, their Zügenruhe is up there, so they've been fattening up and they're getting all agitated, then they'll take off. But if you get kind of a cool spring, or maybe the fall is a long, warm one, and they're not feeling anxious to leave early, and maybe there are headwinds, and so the migration would be difficult. But they're still having Zügenruhe, right? So the behavior is saying it's time to migrate, but the weather conditions are saying it's not time to migrate, then they'll wait. And that's why migration is always a little bit variable by a couple of weeks, and sometimes migration's early, and sometimes it's late, and sometimes it's normal. And again, science nerds like to track this stuff. But this also gives us insights into patterns of wind patterns, temperature patterns. Might make you wonder, will climate change influence the annual cycles of birds? And the evidence here is almost undoubtedly that it will. And there's been an abundance of research done on this, that there are many birds for whom their migration timing has changed in response to the changing climate. And so of research that's been done, roughly 80% of the migratory birds have changed their phenology. Phenology means the study of the timing of biological phenomena. So it's like what's the timing of migration? What's the timing of breeding? And what we're finding is that warmer conditions means birds don't migrate as readily. They migrate earlier in the spring and later in the summer. And so most North American plants and animals have changed their breeding and migration phenology in response to climate change. And some of them have changed their range as well. North American birds and butterflies have shifted their distribution an average of 3.8 miles north. Now, that's not a big number, but when you look at, it's a very measurable number. It tells us that things are changing. And those changes are probably not going to be positive changes. We think that as they change their range in response to temperature, that isn't going to change their range of their habitat at quite the same rate. And so we do see this as very negative and unhealthy for bird populations. So ultimately, their phenology of timing, phenology is, again, the timing of things. So phenology is influenced by a number of different patterns, like food availability and proximate conditions, like weather conditions, in addition to large-scale things like photoperiod, which doesn't change with the climate, right? The day length has not influenced by climate whatsoever. So these proximate factors are changing their annual patterns. Okay, so to summarize, the annual cycles of birds are influenced significantly by both their biological makeup and their physical environment. And they are flexible enough to tweak, but not completely change the timing for their annual patterns of molting, breeding, and migrating. And that climate change and other factors, habitat disruption and other things are altering the patterns of migration and reproduction. All right, I hope you found this stuff interesting. I certainly do. It gives us a clear sense of how these birds know when to leave and when to arrive and when to do their thing. A beautiful part of God's design for helping them to thrive. Have a wonderful day. We'll talk again soon.